Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Syria's new authorities have launched a security operation in the coastal region following clashes in which more than a dozen were killed. It's been about 3 weeks since the Syrian capital of Damascus was overtaken by rebels, forcing former President Bashar al-Assad to flee the country. What are the challenges for power transition now in Syria? Who is leading the country, and how will the new leaders govern this land in the future? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Wang Jin, Director of the Center for Israel Studies at Northwest University, Dr. Sara Yael Hirschhorn, a visiting professor at University of Haifa, and Sharmine Narwani, Editor-in-Chief of the Cradle. Welcome to the show. Well, Sharmine, I will start with you. We know that Assad is gone. The former rebels are now in control of the country. So how do you characterize the current status in the nation?
I think it's early days. It's difficult to say. I mean, the group that has taken the helm in Damascus is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a UN and US designated terrorist organization. There have been immediate and quick efforts to rehabilitate the image of this group. I mean, we have seen Western leaders head over to Damascus and meet with Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, now known by his real name, Ahmad al-Shara. And he's gone from jihadi gear to a suit and tie. So, you know, over the last week or so, we have seen, you know, an HTS foreign minister take the role, a defense minister from HTS, and now an intelligence minister from HTS. Right, these are people who were running Idlib for Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. And the question really, I think, that remains ahead and what everyone's watching is that if there is going to be a genuine transition process to a genuine government, an elected government, as opposed to Syria now being run by a currently still US designated terrorist organization.
Sara, how do you say about the current situation? We heard of or reports of clashes, you know, between the current interim government and the so-called, say, Assad loyalists. I mean, how true is that? You know, does that mean there are still threats to the stability of the government?
Look, I think the country is really a patchwork of different interests, different sectarian groups, different clans, other organizations that have aims both within and beyond Syria, or what we know today is the country of Syria. So I think it's going to be very difficult to say, as Sharmine said, until we have more time to see how this situation will play out. Unfortunately, I think many of us feel we've seen this movie in the Middle East before. We remember the days after the fall of Saddam Hussein, or in Afghanistan or other countries where there was a promising opening in early weeks to bring together different partisan groups after the fall of a dictator who had held the country together for better or worse through, you know, truly strongman and often evil efforts for decades to try to put together a new coalition. But in many of those cases, we saw that those efforts faltered as sectarian interests, financial interests, even terrorist-backed organizations began to take control of different parts of the country. So I fear that that could also happen once again in Syria. The neighbors also, of course, have interests, and I imagine that we will speak about that later in the program, and we may see intervention from them as well. So I think it could, you know, the hope, of course, is for optimism and for this moment of liberation for the Syrian people, but whether they'll be able to make the transition to governance, and of course, as Sharmine said, the further step to democratic, elected, liberal governance is really an outstanding question, I think.
Outstanding question remains unknown. Wang Jin, we know that the leader of the interim government is Ahmad al-Shara from this HTS group. As Sharmine pointed out, you know, it was basically designated a terrorist group, you know, by the UN, the US, the EU, and UK, and others. But of course, himself said that they are not a terrorist group and they consider themselves to be victims of crime against Assad. So I think they are also in the process of transition. But see, are they, say, authoritative enough, or are they enjoying the enough support to run the country, to stabilize the country?
I think it is still early to say about what can be done by the HTS in the future, about whether they could stabilize the regime or whether they could dominate the country, because everything that they are doing and also what is happening in Syria is on the process of transition. We know that now the HTS led the interim government. They hope to show that they are very inclusive. They are very, for example, they are very with the hope to include everybody into the government, and they hope to show the image of open. But the problem is that on the one hand, they still has no kind of the plan or the landscape plan for the future of the political construction or the country reconstruction. So we still do not know what kind of ideology they will hold and what kind of the political plans they get, and how they will cope with the relations with the Alawi, for example, the minority groups in the Latakia province in the western coastal area of Syria, and how they cope with the relations with the Syrian Kurds in the northeastern part of this country, particularly given the fact that the Syrian Kurds, they are still very skeptical about the attitude and the future policies from the Syrian interim government. So even inside the interim government, although they have seemingly that they have the new interim government and they have different ministers has been nominated, but the problem is that we still do not know what kind of relations inside the different factions between the HTS and the Syrian National Army, another very important leading rebels inside the countries, and how to coordinate the relations. So that is why I think, yes, they hope to show that they are very inclusive, they are very liberal, they hope to include everybody inside, they hope to put forward a very successful transition process, before the upcoming March of the 2025, but there were still many obstacles and still many things uncertain.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sharmine, speak of the factions. Of course, we know the HTS dominated. HTS dominated the interim government now. There are different factions. How united are those military forces, between HTS and other, factions over there? Of course, they have a common goal against Assad. Assad now is gone. Now it's about sharing the power. For example, laying down the weapons and have a national defense department. How likely that will be, and how cooperative they are?
Well, from what we understand, the offensive that took down Damascus included HTS and 37 different armed factions. And I think, in covering the Syrian war for almost 9 years, one of the things we often saw was when rebel militias took over an area, a government area, within 48 hours, you would often have the sort of CIA-backed faction and the Turkish-backed faction and the Qatari-backed faction and the Saudi-backed faction at odds with each other. Now, what's notable about the current transition is that all of the new cabinet, transitional cabinet members, look to be HTS officials. The Cradle actually has a correspondent in Syria now who landed in Damascus, has traveled to Aleppo and to Kurdish areas, and our correspondent says that there's literally no security you can see on the streets. So, we know that the transitional government has said that they're going to unite all the factions under a new Ministry of Defense. But how that plays out, HTS is trying to put on a sort of liberal democratic face right now, but we see atrocities being carried out in different parts of Syria, on social media channels all the time now. Of course, it's hard to verify all these videos, but, what made big news recently was the burning of a Christmas tree in Hama, for instance, So these factions are not going to be easily controlled, but I think HTS has dominated the ground in Syria. Even when it was on the losing side, it has still been the dominant group in all theaters, from the north and to the south in Daraa, before that fell to the Syrian government. So they're going to, I think, we're going to see them strong arming their allies, and to get to the forefront to I think help frame the constitution, because this is an important a goal in the near future, is to reconstitute the Syrian constitution. We're going to see what Syria stands for in those, few pages. I think it'll be an important indication. But at the moment, I think HTS is just going to absorb all these other groups and get rid of those that don't play the game their way.
Let's walk back a little bit, Sharmine. The fall of Assad government is a shock, I think, to everybody, basically. So what's behind the quick fall? Is there foreign forces involved? Many people, Trump said that Turkey was behind the fall of Assad. How much does that hold in water?
So, of course, there are foreign elements involved in this. I mean, the operation was greenlit by foreign elements, Turkey being the leader of it. Turkey has said, various Turkish officials early on said, no, we have nothing to do with this, and then lost the ability to take credit for Assad's fall shortly thereafter, whereas the Israelis and others jumped in to take credit. I think, honestly, this was an operation to give the Turkish President Erdogan a strong card to push for negotiations to take out his Kurdish foes in northern Syria. Assad had been, with the Russian and Iranian intermediaries during the Astana process for a while now, been implored by his allies to sit down with the Turks and massage out a deal. And he was resistant to the notion. He refused to do so until Turkish troops left Syrian territory. And I think it was a lost opportunity. In the end, you have to negotiate and deal with your perceived foes. That was a major mistake. Assad also, we understand now through various testimonies of officials, that he refused to ask for help from his Russian and his Iranian allies and even Hezbollah. It was offered and he refused. For what reason, it's unclear, but I think many of us analyze that part of the reason for doing so is the path that was opened by the UAE and other Arab Gulf states to rehabilitate Syria, to help Syria get rid of the punishing U.S. Caesar Act sanctions. As long as he kept Iran out of Syria, as long as he played the game a certain way, they brought him back into the Arab League. I think Assad made the mistake of trusting that process with these newfound allies. Mm-hmm. And not realizing that, and marginalizing maybe his old allies. I know for myself that the day before Assad left Damascus, I had a phone call with let's just say an official in a regional country that is an ally of Syria's, who said to me on that Saturday morning, right? He left on Sunday. On that Saturday morning, we're waiting for Assad to make a decision. And I said, what decision is that? And he said, whether he's going to stay or go. And at that point, most people were thinking that Assad would fight this, would fight the operation, because let's face it, this was a much smaller kind of threat than what had existed for a decade in the Syrian theater. I mean, first of all, these guys, the HTS, et cetera, they didn't have their back covered in Iraq as they did during the Syrian war. They didn't have, all the money and all the support from all these various countries that they had enjoyed during the Syrian war. It was basically Turkey, and of course, now we're learning that there were American hands in this, but I don't think anything substantial. And apparently Erdogan said to HTS and co before the assault, this is your moment. You either win or you completely lose. So I do think this was an unexpected to almost all players in the region.
Yeah, I expected
what
it. Yeah, absolutely. Wang Jin, obviously, man, there is a role played by Turkey. What's in their mind? What's the consideration? What kind of interests they're looking at?
I think Turkey also, what is happening and what has happened in Syria also out of the Turkey's own expectation. Because from the very beginning point, I think Turkey just hope to expand the areas controlled by the HTS and the Syrian National Armies, who have very close links with Turkey themselves. So that is why they hope and they supported the rebels, Syrian rebels, to launch the offensive against the Syrian control army, government forces controlled areas, particularly over the areas around Aleppo, the very center city in the northern Syria. But what happens next is out of the Turkey's expectation, because from the very Turkey's own point, what they want is, okay, on the one hand, expand the area, and on the other hand, try to transfer the Syrian refugees, several millions of Syrian refugees, back to Syria with this new controlled and occupied areas. But what has happened is that Turkey find, okay, they become the real winner. They become the real winner, and Iran have to get out, and also Russia have now faces a very dilemma whether to withdraw their military presence in Latakia and also in the Khmeimim airport forces. So that is why I think Turkey, maybe they have their own goals, but given that the very fast and quick transition inside the Syrian battlefield and Syrian political scenario, Turkey also has to seek new goals. On the one hand, to coordinate the different factions relations, particularly between the Syrian National Army and HTS, and also on the other hand has to maybe try to direct the new interim government, try to persuade them not to become too offensive, not to become too aggressive, try to become more, for example, secular and more open, more inclusive. So that is why I think Turkey also has to consider more than just what their own interests, but now they become their own major player. They have to persuade the rebels to consider more.
Of course, they have their own problem with the Kurds, right? In the northern part of the country, right? And which was supported or is supported by the U.S.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is ongoing.
Yeah, exactly. Because from the Turkey's point of view, as you mentioned, a very important thing. Because from the Turkey's point of view, they believe that the Syrian Kurds, led by we call it the Syrian Kurds parties or Syrian Kurd militias, they define them as so-called terrorists, and they believe, from the Turkey's point of view, that they believe that the Syrian Kurds and the Kurds from the PKK another Syrian, another Kurds important factions inside Turkey, they are actually the same people, but just different names. Inside Turkey, they call it PKK, but then inside the Syrian Kurds, they have other names. So from Turkey's point of view, that they are very watching closely what is happening in Syria, particularly the motivations and the future developments of the Syrian Kurds. So they hope that this kind of new development could be controlled and managed by the interests of Turkey and also with the hands of the Syrian rebels supported by them.
Well, Sara, of course, the people in general would say Israel is another country that benefits, the most probably from the situation, of course, with the occupation of another part of Golan Heights. What is the Israeli plan? They talked about temporary occupation. Is there a possibility that they will withdraw from that part once there's a, say, recognized government in Syria?
Well, I think Israel was also caught quite flat-footed by this, by the fall of Assad so quickly. In fact, Israel had interest in the continuity of the Assad regime, recognizing its brutality and its, frankly, evil character and its conduct during the Syrian civil war, but yet at the same time, kind of the enemy that Israel knew and the stability that it had enjoyed under both Bashar and his father for decades and decades. So I think Israel itself might have even preferred that Bashar al-Assad had been able to stay in power, but when the decision was made, and Sharmine has relayed to us how quickly that decision was made, that this regime essentially was going to come to an end, Israel decided that it wanted to stake out its priorities. The first being to secure its border on the Golan Heights. So it's moved from one side of Mount Hermon, which the Golan Heights on the Israel side of the border, or what Israel considers to be Golan Heights, we can debate that terminology, is a ski resort, but it's moved now onto the recognized other side of that border onto Syrian territory. In the interest of securing that region, knowing also that there's a very shaky ceasefire now with Lebanon only miles away in the same sort of general zone. So I think there is an interest there of securing both issues. And also Israel has taken steps, as far as we know, to try to eliminate some of the chemical weapons and other kinds of military armament and material that could not only be used against Israel if it fell into the wrong hands of some various Syrian militias, but also that it could be transferred to Hezbollah or downwards through the region. So Israel is trying to, I think, look at this through a big strategic picture of what role Syria plays as a linchpin of a wider strategy, one that used to be backed by Iran, but seemingly with the fall of Assad, maybe that source of strength or that backing has been diminished, but still that Syria plays a role not only in and of itself, but as a conduit to other regimes and terrorist groups throughout the region that could endanger its future. So I think those have been Israel's priorities, but I think Israel really was not anticipating this, or certainly not so quickly.
What's the Israeli attitudes or policy on the interim government in Syria?
I think that, like everyone else, it's watching and waiting. They're also, like much of the world, waiting to see what the Trump administration policy will be when it takes office in January, because many of its goals, I think many of the goals of Benjamin Netanyahu are hoped to be aligned with the future Trump administration. So the question is how what to do in this interim period. And I think Israel has looked at this in a very short-term fashion of securing its most immediate security priorities and then trying to align a larger strategic vision with the United States. Though and we'll have to see whether the U.S. sort of rolls back some of the warm greetings to the Syrian officials and even removing the bounty from al-Jawlani's head, as a member of al-Qaeda affiliate. And I think we'll have to see from there how both the U.S. and Israel are able to react. Mm-hmm.
Well, Sarah, I also want you to comment on what Jeffrey Sachs has said. Israel was behind the fall of Assad, and Israel has been pursuing a policy of building a greater Israel in the region.
Look, I have to say, with respect, I disagree with Jeffrey Sachs's analysis. Israel had very clear strategic interest, in fact, in the continuity of the Assad regime. It decided not to intervene very seriously in the Syrian civil war, even when it had the opportunity to do so. Israel certainly was coordinating intelligence and gaining a strategic picture from some of the rebels, including through humanitarian efforts both along the Syrian border and in other countries where Syrian refugees had fled. But I think Israel's had a very much hands-off attitude towards Syria. And because of the complications with other forces, including Russia and Turkey, Israel had no interest in trying to get between Assad and some of his other partners and strategic partnerships. So I don't think that holds water, but I certainly think Israel now is trying to understand what its role is in this very messy picture, not just with the fall of Assad and uncertainty about how Syria will essentially put the jigsaw puzzle back together, but also with Lebanon and whether holding territory of both Lebanese and Syrian sovereign territory is part of its strategic calculus, at least in the short term going forward.
Well, Sharmine, easy to understand for a lot of people. Of course, that's a loss for Russia and Iran, at least in terms of influence, in terms of their own national interest there. What about the U.S.? What does this change of regime mean to the U.S.? What's their strategy here?
The U.S. has always indirectly, for certain, supported HTS and its various renditions from, we know this from a 2012 document by the Defense Intelligence Agency that where the U.S. said clearly it supports even the Salafist groups that are strongest on the ground, which at the time was Nusra, was the al-Qaeda fighters, because they are the ones most able and likely to be able to bring down the Syrian government. So there's always been this, the hypocrisy. We're against al-Qaeda. We've fought a 20-something-year-old war on terror, and yet our partners in the Syrian fight are al-Qaeda and even ISIS. So I just want to make a point to Sarah's point. I understand why a lot of people think that Israel wanted Assad to stay. I know from my personal experience in the Syrian theater, that was not the case. In Quneitra, for instance, which is a Druze area of Syria on the border with the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan, the various Druze officials there constantly were telling me that Israel supports Nusra directly every time Nusra tries to invade their villages. The other firsthand experience I got was in the village of Wang Jin, which is a tiny area on the borders of Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, which was again dominated by HTS or Nusra and Free Syrian Army fighters. Well, the Nusra guys decided to bail and move to Idlib when the Russian, Iranian, Turkish demilitarization deals were going on. And after they left, I met with various FSA and Nusra, former Nusra people there who said that they had been getting salaries, $200,000 per month directly from Israeli sources to keep Nusra in the fight. So there are myriad direct connections between Israel and the militias, the various militias that were fighting Assad. I disagree that Assad worked for Israel. It was a very dangerous time for Israel. Syria was the one Arab ally state of the resistance axis. It was an important transit territory for weapons coming from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, right onto Israel's borders. So, of course, that wasn't the case. The United States is going to do what Israel does basically, which is, I think, have a policy of if you cannot have a proxy government anywhere that is of strategic importance to you, let chaos reign, okay? Sort of cede, the vulnerable, take advantage, be opportunistic about the natural vulnerabilities in a territory, whether they're sectarian, whether they're religious, whether they're economic, etc., and let those flourish and encourage them to flourish, incite them even, and use narratives to frame things and allow chaos again to flourish. And I think that's going to be the U.S. strategy moving forwards, unless they have an absolute lock on Jolani's government, which they may not do because Turkish interests, the Turks and the Qataris are closest to HTS, and they may have other considerations than the Americans. For instance, gas from Qatar through Syria to Turkey to Europe. That may not be in the U.S. interest.
Right.
So I think really we have to wait and watch.
We have to stop there. Well, with that, we are concluding today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qingduo. See you next time.